to welcome everybody to our Main Street two-part historic preservation series. I'm Anna Bly, the Communications and Media Specialist here at Main Street. And our historic preservation series, we think, is a nice lead up to our Main Street Leadership Network meeting that will be held in Raton in August. And that meeting is going to be focused on creating thriving places. Today's webinar is an introduction to historic preservation and the way that it impacts your Main Street district, or why it's important for your Main Street district. I apologize, Amy. And then the second is scheduled on July 18th and will focus on historic preservation requirements as they apply to all of the things that aren't the buildings. So streetscapes, plazas, and courthouse grounds, etc. Today we're joined by Main Street Revitalization Specialist Amy Barnhart, who's going to lead our session today. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Anna. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. I'm sure that most of you have been through this process with us before, but in case you haven't, here is a quick little rundown on how to use the GoToWebinar interface. Yeah, I say 20-minute presentation, but if you've been to any of my other ones, sometimes I go a little bit longer. So I'm guessing that today it will probably be about 20 to 30 minutes. You can listen through your computer or your phone. Sometimes your phone works better. So if you start having some feedback issues, try calling in on your phone. We will allow questions and answers at the end. If there is anything that you ask that I don't have an answer for, I will be happy to work on that and get back to you on that in the very near future. We don't have the PowerPoint slides up for you to download right now, but we are going to send those out to you tomorrow or Friday, so you will be getting those. So what we are going to focus on today is what is historic preservation and a brief timeline of the more formal preservation movement in the U.S. We're going to be looking a little bit at preservation law, both federal and state, and how that impacts your properties. And then we're also going to be going through and just looking at some examples of various architectural styles that you might find in our Main Street districts. I will say I am purposefully not talking about historic tax credits today, just because we did recently go through a variety of changes with the tax code that do impact how tax credits are used. Additionally, I thought I would hold off just in case we are looking at supporting any legislation that might be introduced this year that would potentially alter tax credits and how they are utilized. So if you have questions around tax credits currently, please submit that via question at the end or shoot me an email. Additionally, I would really like to partner up with somebody from the Historic Preservation Division if we were going to do a presentation on tax credits, because they are really the true experts on how to use those and how to undergo that process. Additionally, I will say that the architectural styles that are included in this presentation are definitely not all-encompassing. I purposely left out any styles that we wouldn't see in a commercial Main Street district. So you're not going to see examples of buildings that are residential in nature. And there's probably going to be some other styles that I did not include that you will find in your district, only because they weren't as common. Doesn't mean they're not important, doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about them, but since this is a webinar, I didn't want it to turn into an all-day webinar, which I could easily do when it comes to historic preservation. So with that said, moving forward. So what is historic preservation? According to the National Park Service, it is a conversation about our past, about our future. Provides us with the opportunity to ask what is important in our history and what parts of our past can we preserve for the future. It allows us to look at history in different ways, ask different questions about the past, and learn new things about our history and ourselves. And it's an important way for us to transmit our understanding of the past to future generations. I just want to point out this picture here that I took in Detroit when we were there for the National Main Street Conference a few years ago. You will notice that it is the lone building standing there. The buildings to the left of it have been torn down and a parking lot put there instead. And then behind it, you can see a variety of more contemporary skyscrapers and buildings that have been built much, much later than this one was. And that kind of gives you the sense that, oh, this downtown looked very, very different at a different point in time. And if this building wasn't still here, we may never actually really understand what that particular block and area looked like. So just a really quick timeline of preservation. The earlier preservation efforts were all done privately. There really wasn't anything at the federal level at this time, but private individuals and the city of Philadelphia, for example, saw the importance of preserving Independence Hall. Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington, was privately preserved as well. Yellowstone National Park was recognized by the federal government in 1872, so we start to see some recognition of the importance of preservation. This was a natural environmental resource versus a built resource. Casa Grande is the very first national monument acknowledged by the federal government in 1889. The 1906 Antiquities Act was passed by the federal government. So we start to see some active preservation here. The National Park Service was established in 1916 to manage stipulated federal properties such as national parks and other historic sites. The Charleston Historic District is the first historic district in 1931, created by the city of Charleston. 1933, the Historic American Building Surveys begin. They start surveying all the different historic buildings across the United States, though this doesn't necessarily mean anything as far as preserving those buildings. The Historic Sites Act is passed by the federal government in 1935. In 1949, the Housing Act is passed by Congress, which is referred to as urban renewal legislation, which you could likely thank for that previous picture we saw in Detroit. I'm sure that would be the reason why that is the lone building still standing there, just clearly from the late 1800s. The National Trust for Historic Preservation is established in 1949. 1964, we see the first graduate level program in historic preservation through Columbia University. The National Historic Preservation Act, which we'll be talking more about, is passed in 1966, and this creates the National Register of Historic Places. 1966, Section 4F of the Department of Transportation Act is passed, and that is another tool that we can use for preserving and protecting our properties that are on the National Register. 1978, the National Historic Preservation Act becomes a model for using tax incentives to stimulate preservation efforts. Additionally, the U.S. Supreme Court upholds the New York City's local preservation law, which Penn Central Transportation Company had fought against and went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And they ultimately found that the city of New York had the right to have that law in place. 1980, the National Main Street Center is established by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And the National Historic Preservation Act is amended to include certified local government. In 1991, the Department of Transportation is charged with preservation requirements via the Intermodal Surface Transportation Act. And 2009, the Traditional Cultural Properties Act is passed as well. So that's recognizing properties that are being used for traditions typically related to Native American communities and traditions. So we're going to look a little bit at preservation law. This is another photograph from Detroit. And you can see this is a really, really beautiful historic building. And it is covered in graffiti on the lower half, but you can see on the upper half and all the windows, somebody has gone in and put hearts in the windows and love in various words. So you can tell that somebody totally disrespected this building, but other people do see the value in it the potential for it to be rehabilitated and reused. So the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, this came about via President Johnson convening a special committee on historic preservation to study the current situation and deliver a report to Congress. As I mentioned, the historic American building surveys began being conducted in the 1930s. By this time, there were 12,000 of those completed, but at least half of those buildings were destroyed or so damaged that they were no longer historically significant. What this committee found was that federal agencies needed to make preservation a part of their mission. Prior to this, everything was based around progress. Preservation was really not deemed to be very important and kind of standing in the way of progress. And so as these historic buildings started to come down, as urban renewal was being implemented, people began to fight back, and this issue got some national coverage. So this act, the National Historic Preservation Act, was the most comprehensive preservation legislation known in the United States. I mentioned the Antiquities Act, the Historic Sites Act. There were several different acts that have been passed prior to this, but this was the most all-encompassing and comprehensive that we had ever seen. It established permanent institutions and clearly defined processes for preservation. It established the National Register of Historic Places. It established the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. It also established the State Historic Preservation Offices, which is essentially housed in Historic Preservation Division. Each state was required to complete an inventory of important sites, and then the act was later amended to establish tribal historic preservation offices. And just so you know, going forward, I'll refer to those as SHPO and TIPO. This act also encouraged the concept of locally regulated historic districts. You may remember that I mentioned that the city of Charleston had a local historic district in the 1930s. However, they really legally weren't authorized to do that because there wasn't national legislation authorizing local districts at that time. This act also authorized enabling legislation to fund preservation activities. They also established a protocol that historic structures that would be affected by federal projects or by work that was federally funded had to be documented to the standards of the Secretary of the Interior. And they also stipulated that federal preservation programs and policies would rely on voluntary cooperation of owners of historic properties and not interfere with private ownership rights. As I'm sure many of you know, this is always a great concern of our private property owners when a historic district is being proposed or they're considering purchasing a building that they know is a historic building and a contributing building. Legally, as a private individual, they can do whatever they want with that building. It only affects its status as either a individual resource on the National or State Register, or its status as a contributing building to the either national or state historic district that it's located in. So the National Register of Historic Places is an inventory of over 80,000 historic structures. It's managed by the National Park Service, and you can find it online, or you can also find it through the SHPO as well. I believe you could actually download a database from their website that lists all of the historic districts and sites within New Mexico. I'm not sure how often it's updated. I know I personally downloaded one a few years ago. I'd have to go back on there and see if there's a more recent version of it or not. But it's super helpful because it's organized by county or city. So you can go on there and you can see what is on the register in your community. When you are applying to be recognized on the National Register, you will need approval from the SHPO or the TIPO. And you will also have to put together an application that provides a detailed description of the property or properties, including narrative statements of its history, context, and historic and architectural significance. What the National Register does is it helps provide a review of effects on designated historic properties of proposed development. So for any of you that have worked with your city, perhaps on a capital outlay project, you know that you have to work with the State Historic Preservation Office to ensure that there is nothing being done that will be detrimental to the historic structure that you're working on. This also means that they are involved in early stages of planning policies. So say you're developing a new downtown master plan or a new cultural plan, Historic Preservation Division would have the opportunity to weigh in on that, as well as any policies that might affect historic structures. Owners of historic properties are eligible to apply for federal grants. When those are available, we know that often depends on how the federal government is functioning. The National Register also encourages rehabilitation of income-producing historic properties that meet preservation standards through tax incentives. As I mentioned before, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about historic tax credits, but if you are on the National Register, you are eligible for 20% of your expenses, 20% of your eligible expenses you could receive in tax credits. And if you are on the State Register, you would receive 50% of your eligible expenses in state tax credits up to $25,000 or $50,000 for arts and cultural districts. That's as it currently stands, but as I said, we never know. Hopefully in the future, we can expand upon the dollar amount of tax credits available through the state tax credit program. And as I also mentioned, that there have been some changes that have impacted how the federal tax credits are taken, as opposed to how they used to be used. Additionally, the National Register discourages demolition of income-producing properties through federal income tax disincentives. So when you're looking at putting a property on the National Register of Historic Places, you have to consider a few things when you're evaluating it. Those being the significance, the age, and the integrity of the property. Typically, the property has to be at least 50 years old to be considered historic. Funny because oftentimes people don't think of mid-century modern style buildings as being quote unquote historic, even though many of them now are 60 to 70 years old. So they do meet that threshold, and they're probably, hopefully, representative of an architectural style from that time. It doesn't always have to be 50 years old. There are some times when the property is proven to be so significant that it is eligible for the register when it's less than 50 years old. The other thing to consider is, does it still look much the way it did in the past? If it is altered beyond all recognition, it's not going to be eligible. As long as it still appears historically significant and still has a lot of those characteristics of what that typical historic building would have had, it should be okay. Additionally, you have to consider the significance of it. What makes it significant and what makes it important? There are 4 criteria typically that it would have to meet. A, that it is associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. So that might be if there's a building near downtown in which some significant invention was created, like maybe the garage where Steve Jobs and Wozniak developed the Apple computer. That's a significant contribution to history. So that could be a reason for it to be on the National Register. Additionally, that's associated with the lives of significant persons in our past. So that example I just gave you, that actually could probably meet this criteria as well, because Steve Jobs has had such an impact on culture, everything, technology, everything that we know today in our world. But additionally, this could be the home where Muhammad Ali was living as he was fighting, learning to box, or the boxing gym that he boxed at. That can meet this criteria. C is that it embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or that it represents the work of a master, or that it possesses high artistic values, or that it represents a significant and distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. So C would be the one that we would probably most often use when we are nominating one of our Main Street districts to the National Register. Because our Main Street districts, for example, are representative of a certain period of time, and they represent that historic commercial district. And together, some of those buildings individually might not be as important, but as a whole, they create a historical context and a story about our community that we wouldn't have otherwise. And finally, that it may yield information important to history or prehistory. So this might be more typical of much more of an archaeological type site that we will be mining for additional information to learn about our history. So I want to talk a little bit about Section 106 and Section 4F. These two laws are triggered by federal actions, permits, licenses, or funds that are used. And again, federal being the key word here. Section 106 requires that federal agencies must consider the effect of their undertakings on properties included on or eligible for inclusion in the National Register. If the property is adversely affected, the federal agencies involved must provide the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation with an opportunity to comment. So as I mentioned earlier, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation was created by the National Historic Preservation Act. They are a federal agency charged with preservation, enhancement, and productive use of our nation's historic resources. So they will advise the President and Congress on historic preservation policy, and they will weigh in on Section 106 if it is a case that is precedent-setting or incredibly controversial. Otherwise, your State Historic Preservation Officer, or SHPO, or the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, or THPO, would be involved in this process. So essentially, it is the responsibility of the federal agency to notify the parties involved when they see that they are potentially going to impact a historic property on the National Register, or one that is potentially eligible. So eligible would mean that you would have to meet those criteria that we discussed in the previous slide, but it wouldn't actually have to be on the National Register right at that time. So the thing with this law is it always provides the opportunity for comment and conversation, and it sets into motion a procedure. However, the federal agency involved is not required to alter their original plans after completing the Section 106 process. So to go through this process, they would talk with the SHPO, they would talk to the community that might be interested in how this project impacts things. They would work with the state and local officials. Ideally, they would try to resolve whatever the issues are by mutual agreement and establish a memorandum of understanding to acknowledge that. However, if they cannot reach an agreement, that federal agency can proceed as they originally intended, because they are not required to stop. This law does not expressly prohibit what they're doing. It just requires that they initiate a conversation, essentially, with the interested parties. Section 4F is a bit stronger because it explicitly states that the Department of Transportation cannot use a historic site, park, or recreation area or wildlife refuge unless there is no prudent and feasible alternative to the project, and the project includes all possible planning to minimize harm. Now, clearly, this only relates to Department of Transportation projects. It's not going to be related to other agencies. However, we know that DOT has, throughout history, created a lot of carnage throughout our historic downtown. So it's a great law to have in place. It really just completely prohibits their projects from negatively impacting historic sites. It can also protect historic sites from indirect effects such as noise, unsightliness, air pollution, or impairment of visual and physical access. So this is definitely a strong and more powerful law whenever we need to utilize it. And one of our state laws is actually based on this one, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. So there's quite a few different New Mexico laws that relate to preservation, but I'm just going to specifically talk about the New Mexico Cultural Properties Act and the New Mexico Prehistoric and Historic Sites Act. These, again, are triggered by actions, permits, licenses, or funds that involve the state or its subdivisions, meaning your counties and your cities as well. So the New Mexico Cultural Properties Act makes it unlawful for any person to excavate, injure, destroy, or remove any cultural property or artifact on state land without an archaeological permit. So that doesn't necessarily apply to our Main Street district so much, but it's just included that since it is part of the law. The more relevant element of that to us as Main Streeters is that it does require state agencies to provide the SHPO with the opportunity to participate in planning for activities that will affect properties listed on the State Register of Cultural Properties or the National Register of Historic Places. So again, it legally requires that the SHPO be involved and have the opportunity to participate in these planning efforts. So if there's any money being utilized that's coming from the state, they have to be allowed to participate. The New Mexico Prehistoric and Historic Sites Act is the one I mentioned during the previous slide, which is based on the same language used in the Section 4F Department of Transportation Act. It prohibits the use of state funds for any program or project that requires the use or constructive use of any portion of or any land from a prehistoric or historic site listed in either the state or national register, unless there is no feasible and prudent alternative to such use, and unless the program or project includes all possible planning to preserve, protect, and minimize harm to the site resulting from the use. This can be an incredibly useful law for those of you that have historic districts in your downtown. We know that sometimes our municipalities can choose to ignore some of these laws that relate to their management of historic properties and how they're utilizing funds. We've seen municipally owned theaters that have capital outlay funds. We've seen the project stopped for months and months and months because they failed to consult with the SHPO, and the theater was on both the state and national register. We have seen other municipalities try to purchase historic buildings that are on listed on a state historic district as a contributing building. The county wanted to purchase it and tear it down and turn it into a parking lot. So for this example, they would have to prove that there were no other alternatives to them tearing that historic building down and turning it into a parking lot. As we know, there's probably a million other ways they could identify parking for that situation. And so there's no way they would be able to demonstrate that there was no feasible and prudent alternative to such a use as tearing down that historic building. So I would recommend to you, and I can make this this actual act available to all of you as well. I could email it out. But I'd take a look at it. I'd take a look at your historic district and where its boundaries are and which buildings are contributing, so that you can be prepared if you're ever confronted with an issue in which the state or your local municipality wants to negatively impact one of these historic structures. So really quick, I know we're about half an hour in. I just wanted to quickly go over some examples of architectural styles in our Main Street Arts and Cultural District. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it because I don't want to keep you your entire lunch, but we'll just kind of quickly go through and take a look at some of these. And for these slides, I just have pictures and I have the name of the style. I don't have the additional details listed on there. I will make that available to you whenever we send the handout out. I want you to be able to have those additional information to support you. So the Italianate style was popular in the Southwest largely from 1870 to 90. You will see this style in a lot of our Main Street communities. The two examples I have here are Las Vegas and Silver City, but you can also find a lot of this style in Raton. I know in Carlsbad, the Trinity Hotel is the last remaining building that expresses this architectural style. Typically, there would be low-pitched or flat roofs with projecting eaves, supported by corbels, which you can see on both of those buildings. Along the roof line at the top there, the eave is projecting out. There's decorative corbels underneath. There's imposing cornices, which you can see on the edges of the building there. And they typically have pedimented windows and doors, which you can see on both of these examples. Now, the one on the left is clearly a residence. This is actually the last remaining building on the original Main Street of Silver City, which was washed away by a flood. So when we're down there for the fall quarterly, you should be able to check out this building. It's very, very cool. But typically, whenever you have seen the Italianate commercial style, as you see on the right there, there are cast iron columns on the first floor to allow for the large display windows that you see there. They do have this style does have a vertical emphasis, 2 to 3 stories. Rarely would you see a 1-story Italianate building, but occasionally you do. Low pitched roof and symmetrical windows as well, which you can see on both examples there. Richardsonian Romanesque was popular in the Southwest from 1885 to 90. Here we have an example from Raton and one from Las Vegas as well. You can see clearly that they are using a rusticated stone. It's a very textured looking brick. The colors tend to be monochromatic. You can see the Las Vegas example has a combination of red and brown, which would be the 2 colors that you would typically see on a Richardsonian Romanesque. The one on the left in Raton is more monochromatic, but then you can see along the top, they've actually created a decorative geometric design with the various colors of stonework up there as well. The entries are recessed. You can see they're arched as well. Solid massing, and then a very picturesque style of composition. The neoclassical revival style was popular in the Southwest from 1895 to 1925. You can see the classical symmetry on both of these buildings. Obviously, the courthouse in Deming on the right, an addition was made to the left, so that kind of impacted the overall symmetry, but the symmetry of the original structure was perfect, as is the one on the left, the Chavez County Courthouse located in Roswell. You can see they have that typical temple entrance that you would see in classical architecture, Greek and Roman particularly. There is a full height porch with the columns as well. So you can see it runs the full frontage of the building there. You can also see on the left the dentil cornice along the edge, the roof line there. Another nice little touch. The arched windows on both examples as well. Actually, they have a combination of arched and rectangular as well. Mission Revival typically would be, it was popular in 1893 and 1925. Excuse me, one second. I will just say, as you saw in the previous 3 styles we looked at, those all were inspired by European styles of architecture. Italianate comes from the Italian Renaissance. Richardson Romanesque is actually inspired by German architecture. And then Neoclassical Revival is inspired by Greek and Roman. So here we get to Mission Revival. Now we're getting more to styles of architecture that would be found in the Southwest. This style really comes from the California Mission, but I think we still look at this and we see the Southwest here in this style. Mission style would have light colored stucco or buff bricks, which you can see right there on both examples. Red terracotta tile roofs, which you can see very well in the train depot in Tucumcari. Arcades, which are arched porches. You can see on the left, you can see the arched porches there in Tucumcari. And then on the right, when you see the Luna Theater, you can see those two retail spaces mimic that same style with the arched windows above it, sort of creating that arched porch. They have mixed linear parapets, meaning they are mixing straight and curving lines. You can't see it super well on the Tucumcari Depot, but when you look to the right of that photograph, you can see the curves and then the straight lines there in the parapets. And then the Luna Theater, really, it's just utilizing straight lines for that one. A little bit different interpretation. You can see there's a 10-year difference in the construction between these two different styles. Pueblo Spanish Revival has been through several different phases, and in our districts, we might see quite a few different versions of this. For both of these, you can see that they are flat roofed, adobe stuccoed, and they are modular in their shape. They have the projecting vigas, meaning that those rounded wooden posts sticking out of the front. They are terraced forms. They mimic pueblos and the mission forms. You can see for both of these, they are two-story, and the second story is set back, giving the appearance of a terrace there on the roof of that first level. You often look at these two and you almost get the sense of it being on a stage. There's a stage set quality to it, almost kind of a theatrical look to this style. Spanish Colonial Revival, you can see on the left, the El Morro Theater is a very ornamented interpretation of this, and it has, you can see a Spanish coat of arms in the center there at the top. Quite a bit of decorative elements included. On the right, we have the Hotel Andaluz, which was originally the fourth Hilton hotel ever built. Very similar, some similar elements to the Mission Revival and to the Mediterranean style of architecture as well. Light walls, tiled roofs, as you can see on the left there. Arcades, church towers, which you can see on the Hotel Andaluz, the tower. And then instead of doing the Mission mixed linear parapets as on the left side, the El Morro Theater, you can see a lot more ornamentation there in its place. And the Hotel Andaluz is really a more, almost a more contemporary interpretation of the Spanish Revival style. Territorial Revival combines the Pueblo style that originally existed here in New Mexico and combines it with the Greek and Roman classical style. And so the original version of this architecture was during the territorial years of New Mexico, which is where the name comes from. But then you saw revival of it later on, and you can see here flat roofs, sharp corners, earth-colored walls, the brick cornices all along the roof edge there, and the white classical trim and the columns on both of these buildings, one being a courthouse in Las Vegas and one being one in Truth or Consequences. And sorry, it's such an old picture, so you can't see the details as well, but it's a very beautiful courthouse also. Art Deco became popular in the Southwest in 1925 to 1940. Oh my gosh, I forgot to put the years of the construction of both of these. Sorry, guys. I'll add those in. I believe both of these were in the 1930s. Typically, you'll see the vertical piers and window panels, which you can see there very well on the courthouse in Silver City. Step back massing, shallow geometric ornamentation and symmetry, as well as abstracted classicism, which you can see demonstrated on both of these. You can see how the structure steps up toward the center. On the Odeon, you can see how the Art Deco style steps up to the top of the theater marquee there, even though we are looking at it from an angle. You can tell that they are very geometric. Everything is very symmetrical. And they're sort of monumental as well. You kind of really get this impressive, impactful effect from them when you're looking at them. WPA Modern is very much based on Art Deco and has that monumental feel. This came about during the Great Depression and immediately after, when the Works Progress Administration was funding building new courthouses. And we have several of these in our state. One on the left is in Portales, and the one on the right is in Lovington. Both of these are a really great example, and you can see they're different, though very, very similar to each other. There is that Art Deco feel. They also embody some of those classical elements. You can see some of the decorative motifs on the outside of both of these buildings. And they very much represent that WPA modern feel. These are both great examples. The courthouse in Cray County and Tucumcari, I believe, is another WPA modern as well. So the international style became popular in the Southwest from 1925 to 1960. Typically, you would see these made out of concrete, glass, and steel. But in New Mexico, we really utilize a lot of different materials to achieve the same look. They tended to be asymmetrical, pure geometric forms, which you can definitely see here on the Tavern Theater on the left. Flat roof, oftentimes stuccoed as well, so this one is brick. On the right, you will see the State Theater in Clovis, which is a really great example of streamlined modern. Similar to the international style, except instead of being cubic in shape, these tend to have many more curves and rounded corners, if that even makes sense. I don't know how you can have a round corner, but they kind of have a wind tunnel tested directionality. They have the portholes and the pipe railing, which you can see the porthole glass block window there, and then the curved glass block for the theater marquee. And you sometimes get the effect of looking at a ship when you're standing directly in front of them. Decorative brick commercial, I kind of put this in the end here, even though it's encompassing a few different styles. You can see where it pulls from Richardsonian Romanesque. You can see where it pulls from Classical Revival. And you can also see where it pulls from Art Deco as well. Typically, these would be a 1 to 2 story building that is flat roof. Sometimes it has stepped parapets, which you can see on the right side of that picture there. They would typically be symmetrical facades, which you can see every single one of these in this picture is perfectly symmetrical. They also have very little ornamentation other than the decorative brick work. So those are typically designed into various geometric brick patterns. And you would normally see this large display windows because this style is typically only built for commercial use. So that was a really quick rundown of some of the different architectural styles that we have in our district. Like I said, there are many, many more, and there are many different nuances and versions of some of these. I only showed you 1 to 2 pictures of each. So to get a really complete look, we would have to look at each district and think through what we have there. And for those of you that have historic districts already, you would be able to hopefully refer to the nominating application to better acquaint yourself with the architectural styles and changes that have been made to your district. And typically, to have a historic district, it would be a geographically definable area, either urban or rural, possessing a significant concentration, linkage, or continuity of sites, buildings, structures, or objects, united by past events, or aesthetically by plan or physical development. A district may also comprise individual elements separated geographically, but linked by association or history. A good example of that would be the new National Historic Site that is located in Los Alamos, and there is a second location that is separated geographically from them, which is located on the east part of the country, but they're still considered to be one district. When we think about the context of what's happening in our districts, we want everything to really kind of relate together. And you'll often hear us at New Mexico Main Street talk about this as well. You know, does this building fit the context? Do these changes, modifications to the building fit in contextually with the rest of what you have there? Or if there's an infill project that is going to be undertaken, so you have a vacant space in your downtown, is the thing being built there fitting in contextually with the rest? We don't want it to mimic a historic building and give a false sense of history, but we want it to fit in site overall stylistically in a way that we don't often see when we look at some of the development that's happening these days, unless of course people are being very thoughtful about it. But you know, you can drive down the strip located on the outskirts of town and see 10 different fast food restaurants that have been thrown up, a hotel, a Walmart, whatever, with nothing being done in reference or context with anything else around it. So this term really came into more use when we kind of got to that more modern style of development where context was not being considered. When you go to one of our Main Street districts or historic districts, you will hopefully see a much more contextual environment, things relating to each other. We just looked at a ton of different architectural styles, and even though they are all different, we had the European-based styles, we had the more regional-based styles, then we had the modern styles at the end. They would still all, if they were in your downtown district or your Main Street district, be representative of that commercial style of building or the commercial district. So they work together in that sense. When we think about regionalism too, when we're thinking about any new construction or approaches we're taking to updating our existing buildings, are we approaching it in a way that respects the existing architectural and cultural landscape traditions of our region? We don't probably want to introduce elements that have nothing to do with our community. This could be for buildings. This can be for plantings. If we are planting palm trees in our community that have nothing to do with plants that were originally found there or that really kind of have any use, then what are we doing? Like, what picture are we painting for people about our community? It's very confusing and hard for people to get a sense of the history or the traditions for that community. And finally, preserving our districts and working on the placemaking within them helps create that sense of place that we all want to have. Sense of place is based on the uniqueness of our city, district, or neighborhood that becomes a source for identity, pride, citizenship, and personally felt responsibility. So when we don't consider the existing historic structures, when we don't consider the context, when we don't consider our region and what is respectful to our traditions, we can easily lose that sense of place that needs to be cultivated to not only make people in the community want to be there, but to draw in other people from outside as well and how they want to be a part of that. So I guess I would just ask you to consider how these ideas, how your district relates to these, and consider that when we're moving forward on development projects and that we are trying to use our influence and our education, our knowledge to helpfully educate those around us to get them to start thinking about these different elements. Okay, so that is my presentation. I went much longer than I had intended to, not surprisingly. If you have any questions, please let me know. Please share them with me now. Or if you have any that you would like me to answer via email, I can do that and I can share the information with everyone or just specifically with you, whatever would be best for all of you. Thank you.
Okay, Amy, it looks like we do have a question from Linda DiMarino, who is kind enough to type in. So I'm going to read Linda's question here. What do you mean by disincentive in regards to discouraging demolition of an income-producing property?
That is a good question. And I actually pulled that information from the National Park Service website, but I was not actually able to find additional information on that specific element. So that would be one that I can look into for you, Linda, and get some information back to you on that.
Okay, and I'm seeing, I don't know if that's Cindy Sosa. Did you have your hand raised a while back? If you had a question that you wanted to type in, or I can see if I can unmute you. Are you there? Do you have a speaker? Or hey, Cindy? All right, maybe not. Okay. As Amy mentioned in her presentation and just now, if you kind of listen to this or come up with some other ideas or things you're curious about, you're absolutely welcome to email us here at MainStreet or contact Amy directly with questions about today's session. And I think Amy also mentioned that we will have the presentation piece that she presented today available to you, as well as links to this presentation that we'll have available on YouTube. So again, you could share it with board members or other interested community members. And let's see. Oh, right, there we go. Go ahead, Cindy. You can, let's see if I can have you speak. Cindy Sosa had another question. Can you hear me, Cindy? Can you talk? Okay, can you type a question in? Sorry, Cindy. It looks like Cindy does have a question related to a historic building in Deming. You're also welcome to email us directly, Cindy. Wanted to give her time. Okay, she was having some technical difficulty there, so maybe we'll just have you type in that question later for us. Okay, she's gonna email. Okay. Are you there, Cindy?
Say, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So Cindy's going to email us directly because that's great. But again, at any point, if you're sharing it with other folks and people are interested, Amy is a great resource. And another reminder, our other Amy, Amy Bell, will be presenting kind of part 2 in this series on July 18th. So again, check in with us again for that presentation. Is there anything else you have for us today, Amy Barnhart?
I don't think so, other than if there's anything else that you guys think you would want to learn about historic preservation-wise, send me an email, let me know. We can look at how that could be a webinar or whether that could be a training or what it would need to be. But we would love to start expanding on this area a bit more again.
Well, we really appreciate your presentation today, Amy. So thank you so much. I learned a lot. You're always really comprehensive, and we really appreciate that. And again, thank you all for taking your time today during the lunch hour to join us. It's always really fun to bring you informative content. So thank you all, and hopefully we will see you soon at the Summer Leadership Network meeting. Take care.